Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Crime Tales from Travels, the show where we highlight crimes from places we have traveled to and from, places that we've been or stayed in for a while, or sometimes even places that we have just passed through. I am your host, Kimberly Rotet, and today we have an episode planned for you from a place that I have been to a couple different times to stay there for a professional opportunity, a conference. But we've also just stayed there recreationally, and we've passed through it a couple different times on our way to other Michigan towns. But we're talking today about Ann Arbor, Michigan. But before we dive in, let's quickly review the criteria for the premise of the podcast. So I mentioned it in the opening, but our locations, they make the list if either myself or my spouse have traveled to a location, or maybe we have just kind of traveled to that location together, but could also be separately. Maybe we've spent time in a particular location. We travel a lot for work, so we've stayed in a lot of different places for work. Maybe we've just passed through a certain location on a road trip, because how many times have you stopped at the rest stop because you didn't think you could wait and you find yourself wondering, should I have stopped here? You get the idea, though. We aren't just picking locations of crimes that we want to cover. We are choosing locations that are personal to us because of travel. And we're then researching those locations and those areas and finding these cases and then seeking to share them with you. And today, we're visiting Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I think I mentioned that I've been to Ann Arbor a couple different times for work. I really enjoyed it. I thought the University of Michigan was the pulse of that community in such a positive way. And as a higher education professional by day and only wannabe podcaster by nights and weekends, I appreciate a really good, university vibe that really kind of just impacts the community in a very positive way. So to say that we loved, the campus there and Ann Arbor itself is an understatement. Even today, though, when we talk about that quintessential campus community, we can't help but feel like Ann Arbor is a prime example of this. Before we dive in, though, to the podcast even further, today we're going to be talking about an unsolved case, and we want to get to that, but please don't forget to reach out to us on, social media. You can search Instagram for us by searching Crime Tales from Travels. I also just started an account on Blue Sky with Crime Tales from Travels. It's made me do it like a funky name there, so it might be Crime Tales Travels, something like that, but you get the idea. It's Crime Tales from Travels. A lot of our show notes, in fact, all of our show notes can be found on the website. That's kro.Productions.net. And if you didn't know, Crime Tales from Travels is a part of the kro.Productions network. Today we're going to be discussing the disappearance of Sandra June Horwath. And this is a cold case, for sure, because Sandra has been missing and unaccounted for since 1973. And at the time of her disappearance, Sandra was divorced from her husband, and she lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with her 3 daughters. Let's have a little bit more information about her background, though, if we can. Sandra and her family, though, before they were divorced, so her former husband and her daughters, they moved from Allentown, Pennsylvania to Ann Arbor, Michigan. As the research shared, Sandra's husband was set to earn a PhD in English, presumably from the University of Michigan. However, in 1971, Sandra and her husband divorced, and he then moved to Rochester, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. If you're not familiar with that location geographically, think of it as just a suburb of Detroit. Now, for context, and those who may not be familiar with the Mitten State, I think that's about an hour and 25, maybe an hour and 30 minutes drive from Ann Arbor to Rochester, Michigan. Now, from what I could tell from the source material, and again, all that source material will be in the show notes, and you can find that at kro.Productions.net. But from what I could tell, Sandra's daughters were happy living with her in Ann Arbor, but they also were the kiddos that really looked forward to their weekend visits with their father. And at the time of Sandra's disappearance, she worked at the University of Michigan Hospital. And the night of her disappearance in many ways seemed like a quote-unquote normal night. The source material notes that Sandra took her daughters to the mall. They went to Sears. Man, when I read that, if that doesn't, bring back flashbacks from childhood, I'm really not sure what does. But she took her kids to Sears. They were in search of something. But she also took her daughters then with her to I think it was the Briarwood Mall, and then they went home from there at about 8:30. Now, one of Sandra's daughters, Robin, who was 8 at the time, noted that her mother took a call from a male friend around 9:30 p.m. And just a short while later, so just a short while after 9:30 p.m., Robin recounts that Sandra put all of their daughters to bed around 10 p.m. In also one of those pieces of source material, Robin noted that she had asked her mom if she could sleep in her bed with her that night, but Sandra told her to sleep in her own bed, and that was it. So the girls went to bed. Now after that is where things start to get a little bit, fuzzy when it comes to an awful lot of the details, because when Sandra's daughters awoke the next morning, Sandra was nowhere to be found. Robin, again the oldest, she was the first to kind of stir and wake up, and she went to go look for her mom. She recalls it around 6:30 a.m. She went to go look for her mother, but, she looked for her in the bedroom, but she was not in there. Robin looked outside and saw that her mother's car was in the driveway, but she could not find her mom in the house. Robin, again just 8 years old at the time, called her mother's work, and she asked if Sandra was there, but she wasn't there. Robin then called the girl's babysitter, who came right over, and it was the babysitter who called the police. Now, Robin also remembers calling her father. She recalls that it was her father and the babysitter that kind of, quote, made her go to work or made her go to school that day. In fact, Robin noted she remembered going to school all that week and not being able to kind of wait till she got home to see if her mother had come back. Now, in an article with NBC for the 50-year anniversary of Sandra's disappearance, Robin recalled how the disappearance simply made no sense. The kids went to bed like normal, but then when they awoke, their mother just wasn't there. And after about a week or so of their father staying with them in Ann Arbor, the family sentiment was that Sandra wasn't going to come home. So they packed up and they moved to Rochester with their dad. But let's go back to the night of and the morning after. That morning after, when the police arrived, they noted that nothing appeared out of the ordinary with the house. There, maybe the exception was it looked like one of the flower beds had been trampled on a little bit. But as authorities scoured the house, they noted that while the vehicle was in the driveway, Sandra's purse and her checkbook were missing. To date, those items still haven't been found. When authorities spoke to the neighbors, one of the neighbors did indicate that they heard something around, 10:30 or so, maybe I think it was actually 10:50 outside, but that noise had stopped, so they didn't bother to go outside and look. Now, who is typically the first person authorities might want to try to rule out in situations like this? The spouse, right? However, Sandra's ex-husband, he lived in Rochester, and that's about a 90-minute drive from Ann Arbor. The material said that he cooperated fully with the investigation and ended up taking the children just because he didn't know what else to do. Now, because he cooperated with the investigation and because he lived 90 minutes away and because he had an alibi, for the night before, he wasn't considered a suspect. In order to be kind of thorough when ruling him out, the show notes, the source materials show that Ann Arbor PD interviewed him on multiple occasions and even administered a polygraph. So all those factors considered, he just simply wasn't, thought to be a suspect. So that leaves us asking the question, if not the ex-husband, then who? And honestly, authorities just weren't sure, but an intense search began. Other members of Sandra's social circle were interviewed and also polygraphed, but a suspect did not come to light. In the spring of 1975, so, about a couple of years since her disappearance, the Ann Arbor police then received a phone call from the Royal Oak Police Department. Royal Oak is also in the state of Michigan, and it's about 55 minutes from the city of Ann Arbor. But the Royal Oak Police Department had been contacted about a missing person case from Seattle, Washington. The departments discussed the circumstances of the Royal Oak call missing person and how there were some similarities with Sandra's missing case. The Seattle Police Department believed that their missing person case sounded an awful lot like Sandra's case, but the Seattle Police Department believed their missing person case was the work of Gary Addison Taylor, and Mr. Taylor certainly had ties to Michigan. In fact, he had been arrested in Royal Oak Police Department for shooting at multiple women. So it seems like we've opened up a whole other can of worms here, and we have to ask the question, who is Gary Addison Taylor? From what I can tell, we could do a whole podcast on this individual alone, but for the purpose of this podcast and trying to fill in some gaps with the Sandra Horwath case, we're just going to try to do a quick review, but we will try to do it justice. He had a few different names or aliases: the Phantom Sniper, the Royal Oak Sniper. He was also a robber and serial rapist. So for the sake of this podcast, let's try to run down where he was, his youth and childhood, and how he became the person that he became. But he worked in multiple different states. So Taylor was born, though, in Michigan in 1936. His family then moved to Florida when he was in junior high school. When they were in Florida, Taylor began kind of randomly attacking women with a hammer. Creepy, I know. He was eventually incarcerated as a juvenile, but he was released in 1957, and it was then, at that time, that he returned to live in Michigan. So he's living in Florida, he moves back to Michigan, and this is where he started shooting at women in the streets. I guess that phantom sniper alias, if you will. But he began shooting at women in the streets in the dark and ended up wounding 2 of them eventually. He also robbed, raped, and or stabbed a number of other women around this same time. And in 1961, he was living in a rooming house, like a house for where he was just renting a room, and he threatened the rooming house manager and her daughter with an 18-inch butcher knife. Later being apprehended for his crimes, he was declared insane and committed to Michigan State's hospital. He later transferred to the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit after 3 years, and he was eventually released and deemed suitable for outpatient treatment. So he required, to report in regularly to ensure that he was staying on his medication. But then in 1972, Gary Allen Taylor, he met a woman, and they got married. So this was 1972, and he married a secretary named Helen, and with this marriage, that ended up moving them to Seattle, Washington. However, they did divorce not that long after that, and that's when Taylor moved to Houston, Texas. While living in Houston, he raped a pregnant 16-year-old girl and is suspected of murdering a 21-year-old go-go dancer. In late 1973, Taylor stopped taking his medication and failed to show up at a hospital. He subsequently was classified as, quote, an escaped mental patient. And as an escaped mental patient, again, he moved around. In November of 1973, he abducted and murdered a young housewife named Vonnie Stuth. Officers investigating this particular case tracked him down to, unfortunately, I'm probably going to butcher this name, in Enumclaw, Washington, and this is where he was arrested. When the police realized he was a mental patient, though, they felt like they had to release him, and he was sent back to Houston. So, follow me on this. We're kind of going to recap real quick. Born in Michigan, moves to Florida, moves back to Michigan, gets married, goes to Seattle, gets a divorce, goes to Houston, Texas, does some things that he shouldn't be doing, ends up in the state of Washington, gets arrested for the things that he is doing, but when they realize that he is a mental patient, they have to release him, and he is sent back to Houston, Texas. And in May of 1975, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a woman. When she heard of his arrest, he told some police that and he had bragged about killing 4 people in San Diego. So somewhere in all of his transient movements, he could have been in California, San Diego specifically, and committed some crimes there. Taylor quickly confessed to committing 4 murders, and 2 days later, an investigation turned up the bodies of 25-year-old Lee Fletcher, 23-year-old Deborah Henneman. Now, these bodies turned up in his Michigan home, but Taylor also made written confessions for the deaths of Stuth and 21-year-old Susan Jackson, both of which were found back up in his home, and again, I'm going to probably butcher the name, Enumclaw, Washington. He was eventually convicted of the 4 counts that he confessed to and sent to Washington State Penitentiary. So clearly, Mr. Taylor was a very concerning citizen, and as you heard, he was also quite transient, but he only confessed to 4 murders. However, clearly law enforcement in the 70s felt this urge to connect the dots of Gary Addison Taylor to Sandra Horwath. However, the case has simply never been solved. If we follow that timeline, then Taylor was on leave from the mental hospital in Michigan at the same time Sandra Horwath disappeared. And it's a connection that law enforcement have made and really kind of clung to. If Gary Addison Taylor was in fact involved, then that's something he's not sharing. From what I can tell, I can't find a death notice for Mr. Taylor. I can't help but wonder if anyone is still speaking to him about other cases, because he is suspected to been involved in at least 20 murders, but he's only serving time for the 4 that he said that he did. This case was a little bit intense. Talk about really appreciating the city of Ann Arbor and the university that's there, and juxtapose that with kind of a situation where we just don't have all the details, and it just kind of sits really uneasy. So it was really kind of intense, and I don't mean, the awesome, kind like camping. If you couldn't already tell, I'm a, proclaimed dork with comments like that, but it was definitely intense. It's an unsolved disappearance of over 50 years, with the suspicions of a brutal serial killer being responsible, with no actual proof that is public knowledge anyways. Before we wrap up, though, please again be sure to find us on social media. It's Crime Tales from Travels on Instagram. You can search kro.Productions Network on YouTube, where we post additional content about cases in the news and what we are currently researching. And if anybody has any information about the disappearance of, Sandra Horwath, or how Gary Addison Taylor may or may not have been involved, please do reach out to your local authorities. Thank you for listening and for tuning in. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review if you enjoyed today's episode. And remember, stay curious, stay safe, and also remember that the truth is often stranger and more disturbing than fiction.